Thanks for joining us again on Fixity Fix. Today, I'm going to walk you through my process for doing an oil change on our 2015 4runner. You've seen this 4runner in a number of our other videos. Please check them out and see what you think. Fixity Fix! I've never done an oil change video yet on the 4runner because my system is a little bit different. And then it occurred to me after a bunch of different oil changes on this car that I probably ought to show this because it might be something that you're interested in, and you might make your life a little easier if you're doing your own car work too by making the skid plate modification and the Stahlbus drain plug modification. First thing you're going to need is some safety goggles and probably some gloves. You'll see me wearing them when I start changing the oil. You don't want that stuff on your hands. It's got some carcinogens in it, so good to avoid getting dirty with it. I use the Toyota brand 0W20 motor oil, and you'll need 6.6 quarts of it for a full oil change that includes changing the oil filter. If you're doing the usual process for an oil change, I can't remember, it's either a 17 mil or a 14 mil socket to take off the drain plug on the bottom of the oil pan. I use a different system, and I've replaced the drain plug. Instead of the usual oil drain plug on this vehicle, I'm using a Stahlbus drain valve, which is just a ball valve that drains the oil through this little hose to keep things neat, quick, and easy. I'll show you when we get under the vehicle how I do that. I'll also leave a link for the Stahlbus ball valve for you on Amazon if you choose to do it that way. There's also a special oil filter wrench required on Toyotas, and I'll leave a link in the description for the one that I'm using here. While I'm at it, I'm going to replace the air filter, the engine air filter, and I'm using a Fram Extra Guard product. It's catalog number 10835. I'll also leave a link for the oil filter and the oil itself. I've found the best prices for cases of both of these on Amazon. Additionally, changing the oil on 4runners can be a pain because you have to remove the entire skid plate, or at least pivot down the factory skid plate in order to access the oil filter. There is a panel on the factory skid plate you can remove to drain the oil, but the plate's got to come off, or at least come most of the way down, to access the oil filter. So I'm using an RCI aluminum skid plate that I bought after I did my first oil change with the factory skid plate. It was around $400, so takes a bite out of the wallet, but has saved so much time and is just kind of cool in the process. So I'll leave a link for the RCI site if that's something you decide to do to make your life a little bit easier. Let's get the car in the bay and get started. This is easier with the car on jack stands or on ramps. I'm going to go ahead and put it up on the lift here just to make it easier to see everything. I'm also going to rotate the tires while I'm doing this, so the lift is super handy with that, or jack stands. The first thing before I get the car in the air is I'm going to take off the oil fill cap. That's going to make the oil drain more easily when I do open up the drain plug. Here we are under the front of the car. You can see the RCI skid plate. First order of business is to remove the drain plug. Again, I'm using a different system here. There's a panel on the factory skid plate that you have to remove with a couple of bolts. I think they're Allen head bolts. Here, for the Stahlbus system, we just remove the safety cover first. And then you can see in here, there's a ball valve that's going to be activated by sticking this hose end here in and turning. I've made a little modification where I've used a zip tie to secure the hose, because the hose was always coming off and spilling oil everywhere, even though this is supposed to be a spill-proof system. I like to use a measured container to see exactly how much oil is coming out of the car. Line it up I'm just lining it up right underneath with a pan, just in case anything goes wrong. Because I'm up on the lift, this hose isn't quite long enough, so we'll just have to be a good aim. And this is going to clip right in here, and then click and turn, and then oil will come out of this hose. Once I engage this fitting, the oil's going to flow. Because we're on a lift, I'm just going to hold this so I can aim it correctly. If the flow seems at all restricted when you're using one of these Stahlbus systems, then the ball valve fitting needs to come out, because there's something that's fallen to the bottom of your engine that's plugging things up. That's one thing to consider when using this system. If the flow seems at all restricted, then you probably shouldn't be using the system, and it means there's something in your engine moving around in the oil that shouldn't be there. So keep an eye on that if you decide to use the system, and it's essential to do oil changes on these at least every 10,000 like the factory recommends. I do every 5,000, and this oil is black. I'm using a graduated container here where I've marked off each quart just to see how much oil comes out. That can let me know if I'm burning any oil or leaking, although there's better indications that it's leaking than the amount that comes out. You'll see oil underneath your car or dripping or something, stating the obvious, I know. When changing oil on any car, it's a good idea to make sure that you've run the car for a little while, driven it around. You want to drain the oil when it's hot, and that way all the debris that's in the oil is going to be suspended within the oil and will come out as you do the oil change. Already got 3 quarts. We're going to expect to see almost 6 quarts come out, and then there's about another quart, a little less than a quart, suspended in the oil filter. Let me make sure that the oil filter access port is in the frame here. So one of the magic things about this RCI skid plate is it gives you a port to be able to do the oil filter change without having to take off the whole skid plate. As there's less volume coming out of the drain pan, it's normal for the flow to slow down. There's less weight and less mass behind the oil pushing it out. So that doesn't mean it's clogged. It just means that physics are at play here, so I'm not worried about the flow slowing down a little bit as we get less oil in there. These are 5mm Allen head? Yeah, 5mm Allen head bolts. I'll tell you one other thing while we're waiting on this to drain. I bought this 4runner used with a little over 19,000 miles on it. It had all of its service records. All of the service had been done by a Toyota dealer in Florida, and there had been 2 oil changes by the time I bought it by the same dealer in Florida. And they neglected to put back in most of the bolts holding the factory skid plate to the car. It's things like that, even happening at a dealer, that make me want to work on my own cars, and also made me want to go ahead and put this skid plate in. I appreciate a lot of things about Toyota engineering, but that seemed a bit unnecessarily complex, and I'm sure they did it to save money on the builds, in the same way they install speakers that tend to blow out within the first 5,000 miles of use if you like listening to music at all while you ride around. So one of the first things I did was install this skid plate many years ago and put in infinity speakers all the way around. All right, we've got, right at 6 quarts, which is exactly what we should see coming out of this thing. If less comes out, it means a number of things. Maybe enough didn't go in on the last oil change, Maybe your engine's burning oil. Maybe you've got a leak. So check for those things while you're under here. We're just going to let that drip while we work on the oil filter. Another super complicated bit of Toyota engineering is that you don't get a standard oil filter on this car. You get a filter element like this, and the housing is reusable. I like that from an ecological standpoint. From a simplicity standpoint, not so great. So we drain the filter housing, and most of the filter elements are going to come with a little plastic fitting like this. Or you can get yourself one of these gadgets to drain it with a hose that'll drain the oil exactly where you want it to go out of the filter housing. A lot of times it's a good idea to just let the oil drain for an hour or a couple of hours. If you're doing a quick oil change, that's not essential. Most of the schmectigus has come out in the oil by now. So I'm going to go ahead and close this off so I can drain the filter housing into the same container that I'm using to drain the oil pan. And for the Stahlbus system, it's just a counterclockwise turn, and this thing detaches, and the oil pan is officially sealed. We do want to put the safety cover back on, just in case anything goes wrong with the ball valve. It'll keep your oil from draining out unexpectedly. It has an O-ring in there, so good and finger tight is good enough. Here we are on the ground underneath the vehicle, looking up from the ground near the front of the engine compartment between the engine and the radiator. Engine side, radiator side. This is the drain plug for the oil filter housing, which is this plastic part here. You can get an aluminum part from Toyota. I just haven't done that yet. I may or may not do it. This plastic part's been fine. With just a socket wrench, a 3/8 drive socket wrench set to counterclockwise to remove, pop the socket wrench, or better yet, an extension on a socket wrench into this hole, and then crack it loose. It's not in there very tightly. And then this just comes out by hand. And maybe a little bit of oil will drain out. That's normal, don't worry about it. Now, to drain the oil out of the oil filter, you can stick this plastic piece that comes with the oil filter element with these sides in just to this brass fitting. Press it in, and then the oil will come pouring out of this plastic piece. If you have one of these fancy gadgets that I'll leave a link for you to get, you can just screw this in, and then the oil will come flowing out. I'm going to show you that method. This does point straight down, so either works fine. This knurled piece has to be backed all the way out when this gets screwed in first, so this part gets screwed in by hand. You can't screw it in anymore by hand. It doesn't have to be tight. Then turn the knurled piece clockwise, and then it drains out the oil filter housing. Again, there's not a lot of oil in here in the filter housing itself, so don't expect Niagara Falls. More along the order of old guy trying to take a leak in the middle of the night. I feel like in my spare time I'm going to have to take a heat gun to this hose and straighten it back out. And honestly, usually when I do these oil changes, I'm not up on the lift here, and I can just let the hose land naturally here in the used oil container. I either take my used oil to the local Firestone where I get my cars aligned, or to the Advance Auto Parts that's a half a mile from here, and recycle it there. Let that drain until it stops. While I'm down here, I'm just looking around and making sure nothing looks out of order. And for signs of any leaks, anything missing, no oil pooling around the struts. Brake system looks good, nothing leaking there. While that continues to drain, I'm going to check out the back, and then I'm going to rotate the tires. The tires are rotated and the flow has stopped, so we'll first back off the knurled fitting in here, which is going to release the oil in the tube. Still backing off the knurled fitting. It's hard to see in all that darkness. And then we're gonna unscrew the whole apparatus from the filter housing, one-handed style. And that leaves us with the oil filter housing to remove using the special oil filter wrench. Just to protect things and keep up with the parts, I'm going to screw this little oil filter housing drain element in hand tight. You can see on this side there are these little notches that are going to interface with this special wrench, these notches here. So that only fits in one way, all the way, lining up the notches, clicks in tightly, and then the whole filter apparatus can be spun out using the same 3/8 socket wrench that we used to drain the filter housing. It's a good idea to keep a drain pan underneath because a little oil will still come out. We'll do that now, putting the camera on a tripod. You've gotten a sense of how all this works, and you'll be able to watch it from a distance now. I'm using an extension. You don't have to. A 3/8 extension. I happen to be using a wobble extension just because it helps me get at things. We're lining up the 3 indents here and the 4th indent with the similar notches on the oil filter housing. I'll show you that more closely once the thing's removed. And then this lines up correctly, and then you break it free. It's got significant force, so you're working pretty hard to get this thing out. That's all right. Just keep everything lined up. Make sure those notches are lined up. Otherwise, you'll risk cracking the housing. And then the filter housing and filter element come out. Once the filter housing comes out, this is what's left behind. Make sure all that's clean. Make sure there's no washers or gaskets stuck in there. And then we'll take the housing over to the bench. So this is the housing that we took out of the vehicle. This is the plug for releasing the oil from inside the filter housing. This metal piece screws out of the plastic piece. You saw me do that. And then the drain plug that comes with the filter kit just pops into here like that, and then it drains the oil from the housing before this thing is unscrewed. Up inside the engine compartment, you can see these 3 notches line up with these 3 notches in the special filter wrench. Do not use a filter wrench that doesn't have these 3 notches, or you'll end up damaging and cracking this plastic filter housing, which has to maintain its integrity. So this goes in just like this and then screws out the whole filter housing. You can see on the other side there's another location notch, another clocking notch, so all 4 of those have to be in place for this to be removed. Once this is out, this paper filter is the part that is replaceable, and it pops right off of there, and it can go on either way. There's not a correct orientation. It just pops in and then presses down. It's spring loaded in the bottom. I'm going to spray this out and clean it off camera because I want all of the detritus from the old engine oil out of here for a clean install. I've gotten the filter housing scrupulously clean with brake clean. Let it dry all the way. A good filter kit's going to come with one of these drainage pieces. It's going to come with, in addition to the new clean paper filter, and keep that extremely clean as you work, 2 new O-rings. One O-ring goes in place of the old O-ring here on the bottom of the filter housing. The old O-ring goes in the trash. This O-ring goes right here inside this fitting. We'll do that one first. And this metal piece goes right in over the O-ring. We're just going to do a little bit of tightening on this metal piece here. It's fine to go ahead and put that back on. Do not install your oil filter or try to remove your oil filter using this piece. Always use the special wrench that grabs on to these nubs. When reinstalling, it's going to be difficult to see this from underneath, but we're going to click this in like so, and this little indicator, this metal indicator, is there's gonna be a tab that it's going to click past to let you know that you've torqued your oil filter housing properly. The next O-ring, and this O-ring is at the bottom of the threads here. This is going to have to come off, and then it's going to be replaced with the new O-ring. And this is the O-ring that you'll want to put some fresh engine oil on so that it doesn't get snarled up. So the old one comes off and gets thrown away, and the new one goes on exactly where the old one came off. New ones are always a little tighter, and it goes right into this little valley, and then just run a little bead of fresh oil around it before you install it. The new filter element, again, it doesn't matter which side goes in. This pops on around this piece and make sure it's still spring loaded, and that is ready to go back in the car the same way it came out. Just to keep it clean, I'm going to keep it in this box like this until it's time to install it underneath. All right, here we are underneath the front driver's side of the car. Now I'm showing you above the skid plate and reaching through the oil filter housing access hole. This is the notch I was telling you about that interfaces with this indicator on the oil filter housing. I've oiled the O-ring. I'm carefully moving this up without touching the filter element on anything into here, and then we begin screwing in the housing, and you can see this clocking indicator and torque indicator passes by this notch, where ultimately it's going to land on top of it and click over it to let you know you've gotten your housing on exactly the right torque. Starting to give me some resistance, so now is when I put the filter wrench on, making sure that it lines up properly. A little hard to see from this side. All right, you can see that the notches are all in the right place. And this turns in, and you keep turning. Until this clicks right there. Right over this notch is just a little flange in the metal, and once this crosses that flange and is lined up with this notch, over this flange, under this flange, and right here, that means your torque is good. So your whole filter has been installed. Make sure that if you haven't already, you replace this drain plug for your oil filter, make sure your car's main drain plug is back in, or your Stahlbus valve is closed and has the safety plug on it. Now it's time to fill the car up with 6.6 quarts of oil. I almost forgot. We got to put the skid plate oil filter housing cover back on. This only goes on, only fits one way. 5mm Allen wrench will get these tightened appropriately. The job's actually easier when it's not on a lift. I like these Allen brand Allen wrenches. I'll leave you a link for those in the description. They've become some of my favorite tools in the shop. They've got a ball end on one side for screwing in, and then on the torquey small side, it's squared off for a little more grab. These I've had for probably 7 or 8 years. Still around, come in handy. All right, now we're ready to go back topside and fill the car up with oil. You don't want to forget that part. Usually when I do an oil change, I will leave the full new containers of oil sitting on top of the engine so that I just can't even close the hood without putting new oil back in. A clean funnel is a godly funnel. And on the driver's side, the American driver's side anyway, is your oil fill cap. It says 0W20 on it. That's the weight oil that you should use. 6.6 quarts if you've changed the oil filter, about 6 quarts if you didn't. I change the oil every 5,000 miles and the oil and filter every 10,000 miles. Does your 4runner sound like it has a diesel engine? Most of them do. I've done some research and some experimentation with this car since I've had it. It's normal for them to sound like a diesel engine, just the way the lifters and valves are set up on these things. They tend to be a little bit noisy. I started out like most people and was using a high quality full synthetic 0W20 oil. I was using Pennzoil Super Platinum, I think, whatever the nicest Pennzoil is. I like Pennzoil in general for motor oils. I learned that most Toyota dealers, including the Toyota dealer here in Roanoke, don't often stock the Toyota brand oil, and they'll use whatever bulk oil they can get in full synth 0W20. These engines end up sounding diesel-y, like they're grinding gravel. The Toyota brand oil has a huge amount of molybdenum in it. It's a friction modifier molecule, and it coats the metal parts in a way that keeps them quieter because it's sort of a soft type lubricant. So a couple of oil changes ago, I switched to the Toyota brand oil, and it made a difference for the first 500 miles, and then it was sort of noisy again for the rest of that interval. But my second oil change with the Toyota brand oil, the engine's been much quieter ever since. So I'm going to keep going to the trouble of using the Toyota brand high molybdenum 0W20 motor oil. It's made a difference for mine, so I'll keep using it. I don't think you're going to harm your engine by not using it. In fact, a lot of Toyota dealers don't even use it themselves. 6.6 quarts go back in. Using a funnel that I cleaned off. You don't want any dust from the funnel going into your engine, do you? These bottles, by the way, are designed to be poured sideways. Not like that. It works like that, but it's smoother and less glurgy when you dump it in sideways. Keeping the empties close at hand in case I lose track of how much I'm pouring in. It's a good idea while refilling to take a look down in the bottom of the car and make sure you actually did put in your fill plug. Check for leaks before, during, and after refilling with oil, and definitely after your first startup. You want to make sure there are not leaks. Number 5. Let's talk about this 6.6. Well, if you've seen my transmission videos, you know I'm fastidious AF about the amount that goes in. So these quart bottles have milliliters and ounces. 0.6 quarts is 19.2 ounces. So I've put 19.2 ounces from a fresh bottle of this oil into one of the empties right up to a little above 19.2, and that's what I'm going to pour in to make sure I get that 0.6 as exact as I can. Probably doesn't make a big difference in the long run, but why not get as close to perfect as we can? All right, light up those comments with things like the perfect is the enemy of the good and stuff like that. It probably is. I could have been finished an hour ago. .6 quarts. We're cleaning up any spills. We're cleaning off the funnel. And most importantly, we're putting back in the fill cap. The next step is going to be starting it up and checking for leaks. That's really not worth showing, but just know that I'm going to start it up. I'm going to look under the car. I'm going to let it run for a little while, watch for leaks from the top of the engine and from the bottom, and be looking at pretty much anything else I can see and just make sure everything's running fine. Also, I rotated the tires when I had the car up on the lift, and I'm now that it's on the ground, I'm going to check the torque and make sure they're at 80 foot-pounds. The factory spec for the aluminum TRD wheels that I have on this particular 4runner is 76 foot-pounds. Some people just gorilla them all the way to 100. I go with something in the middle, and that happens to be 80 for me. I tightened all the lug nuts to contact in a star pattern with the pneumatic wrench. So I didn't torque them all the way, but I got everything down, and then now that the car's on the ground, we can torque everything down. It's important not to use any wobble extensions. It's important not to use any wobble extensions and to use a star pattern when you're torquing these down. Once I've done a star pattern, just to make sure I haven't missed anything, I'll go around and order and gently check the torque on each lug nut. Can't tell you how many times I've found one I've missed that way just by getting distracted or making a video or something. Air filter's super easy. Got 4 clamps to undo. And this thing pops right off. Air filter peels right out. Fuzzy side down, rubber side up. Make sure there's nothing building a nest down in here. All right, we're gonna eyeball all of our work and make sure nothing's amiss. We'll start the car and make sure there's no leaks. After a test drive, we'll let it sit and then check the oil and make sure the oil level reads properly on the dipstick on flat, level ground. Thank you again for watching Fixity Fix. Please make sure to subscribe to our channel if you find this kind of content helpful. Leave me some comments, teach me something. Give us a like because that helps get the video out to a wider audience. Check in next time, and to make that easier, hit the little bell by the subscribe button, and that'll give you a notification anytime we drop a new video.